Good morning and welcome. I acknowledge, celebrate and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands and over whose airways I'm speaking to you today, and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you to the ANU and to today's conference. For those of you who do not know me, my name is McNaughton, and I'm the Director of the ANU Centre for European Studies here at the Australian National University. I'm stepping in this morning for my colleague and friend, Dr. Kasia Williams, our Deputy Director, who has tested positive for COVID and is currently in isolation. Kasia gives her apologies, and we all wish her a full and speedy recovery. I take this opportunity to publicly thank Kasia for all her hard work in bringing today's event to its fruition on such an important and timely topic. I also thank Dr. Wenting Ching and our student interns for their help today, together with the colleagues from the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, who have worked with Kasia and have helped with all the logistics of today's event. Renee, Michelle and Nicole, thank you. This conference is organised by the ANU Centre for European Studies in collaboration with the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. The ANU Centre for European Studies is the oldest research centre in Australia, focused on the study of Europe and the European Union. We are also one of the oldest such centres in the region. The ANU Centre for European Studies is an ANU-wide platform for research and collaboration with Europe, with strong links to government and industry. We engage in and promote inter and transdisciplinary dialogue and deliver research, education and outreach with the support of the Erasmus Plus programme of the European Union. I am particularly proud of our track record in this regard and our continuing successful work, notwithstanding the challenges that the pandemic has presented. As I said, we are collaborating today with the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. The Institute connects people with climate, energy and disaster risk research from the Australian National University. Its goal is to advance innovative solutions to address climate change, energy system transitions and disasters. The Institute facilitates integrated approaches to research, teaching and policy, industry and community engagement across disciplines. It also leads the ANU Below Zero initiative, which is working to reduce the university's greenhouse gas emissions to below zero. We at the ANU Centre for European Studies value greatly collaborations such as this that give us the opportunity to strengthen and promote the promotion and defence of the shared values on which our rules-based international order rests. Today's event focuses attention on the shared values expressed in particular in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Goal 13 of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Within this rules-based international order, the EU holds a unique place with a highly developed legal and political structure through which the member states, both large and small, exercise their sovereignty to the benefit not only of the EU collective, but to the benefit of us all. The EU is an important counterweight to other global powers now, more than ever, reminding us that peace, mutual respect and unity in diversity must always be at the heart of our collective endeavours. Within the EU, smaller states enjoy a level of substantive equality, solidarity and engagement that may often be absent in other more conventional intergovernmental organisations. Environmental policy has been a shared competence of the EU and its member states since 1986, when the Single European Act introduced the first substantive treaty amendments to the 3 founding treaties of what is now the European Union. Since that time, all EU institutions and member states have worked collaboratively, although of course not always harmoniously, to develop this important area of policy. I was encouraged to hear the comments of the incoming Australian Prime Minister that it is a show of strength to collaborate and work with people, not a weakness. Today, we are fortunate to hear from a range of experts who will speak to this topic in greater detail. The focus of today's conference highlights the intersection of environmental policy, a shared competence within the EU, as I have said, and international trade policy, a policy area that falls for all practical purposes within the exclusive competence of the EU institutions. The conference is part of the ANU CES Jean Monnet project, third country engagement with changing EU trade policy. This project seeks to explore and improve understanding of the EU's evolving trade policy and its implications for third countries, including Australia and countries in the Indo-Pacific region. During 2020, as we adjusted to new ways of operating required by COVID-19, we focused on analysing recent EU trade treaties, particularly their scope and intellectual property chapters. In 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has escalated tensions between energy transition, energy security, and energy trade, not only for Europe, but also globally. This conference brings together academics, policymakers, and industry experts to explore the implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for energy transition and global energy trade. The EU's trade policy is undergoing change. External events, including growing protectionism and defensive trade policies, have forced the EU to take a more active role in promoting a positive vision of trade. Within member states, citizens have led calls for greater transparency and public engagement on trade issues, including the content of trade agreements. The implications of this shift in EU trade policy for third countries has not yet been adequately investigated. The EU's increased interest in transparency, accountability, and a progressive trade policy will have profound effects on third countries, with a flow-on effect for bilateral and multilateral negotiations. Examples of this include the EU's renewed interest in trade agreement chapters on the Sustainable Development Goals and environment and labour protections. Our first session today sets the scene for the day's presentations, discussions and reflections. Our first speaker is His Excellency Dr. Vasyl, the European Union Ambassador to Australia. Dr. Pulch took up his appointment following his previous term as EU Ambassador to Singapore. Prior to that, Dr. Pulch headed the Russia division in the European External Action Service in Brussels, where he coordinated EU policies on Russia and chaired the EU Inter-Service Group on Russia. From 2006 to 2011, he was posted to Beijing as Deputy Chief of Mission of the EU delegation to China, in charge of EU policies on China and relations with Mongolia. Dr. Pulch entered the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1986, serving in the United Nations Directorate before he was attached to the German Embassy in Seoul as a political officer. Our second speaker today is His Excellency Mr. Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia, an appointment he has held since April 2022. His Excellency has over 20 years' experience in strategic communications and government relations, working with the Ukrainian government, NGOs and Ukrainian clients in Washington, London, Brussels, Frankfurt, Davos and the Gulf. Mr. Myroshnychenko was the co-founder of the news agency Ukraine Crisis Media and the CEO partner of CFC Big Ideas, an international communications consultancy. He has also been a frequent foreign policy commentator. Our third speaker and co-host for today's event is Professor Frank Jotzo, Professor of Environmental Economics and Climate Change Economics at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, where he directs the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy. Professor Jotzo is also Director of the ANU Grand Challenge Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific. Professor Jotzo has senior authorship roles with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and is Joint Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Climate Policy. He leads research topics including decarbonisation strategies, economics of energy transition, policy instruments for climate change and environment, and international trade and investment. He has advised national and state governments, international organisations and businesses. Now, before I hand over to His Excellency Dr. Pulch, may I ask you all to please ensure that your phones are switched to silence or switched off. At the conclusion of remarks from our three speakers, there will be time for questions and discussions, so I ask that you please hold your questions until then. In the interest of hygiene and safety, we have eschewed a handheld microphone for questions. So should you have questions or comments at the end, would you be good enough, please, to stand in your seat, identify yourself, and address your question or comment clearly to the panellist to whom you wish to speak. It now gives me great pleasure to invite His Excellency Dr. Myroshnychenko Pulch, Ambassador of the EU to Australia, to the lectern. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anne, for your kind words of introduction, and good morning, everyone. Let me also start by acknowledging the traditional custodian of this land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and future. Now, thanks for this opportunity to address this important topic today: global energy transition, energy trade in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And firstly, I'd like to extend my thoughts and sympathy to the people of Ukraine on this occasion. My remarks today will be based on three key themes: climate change and the energy transition, energy response to the Ukraine war, and accelerating European Green Deal, and thirdly, the role of Australia. Now, let's start with climate policy and energy transition. And here's a statistic at the outset. About 8% is the EU's share of global emission standards. So that means that this makes us the third biggest emitter globally, but also it means that this relatively modest percentage means that we have to have a concerted global cooperation on climate change. Otherwise, we'll not be able to achieve our goal to mitigate the impacts. Our own track record is good. In 2020, our emissions were 31% below 1990 levels, but we need to go further, and we will. We have given ourselves a new target for 2030 of a reduction of 55% or more from the 1990 levels. That is up from the previous target that we had of 40%. And our legislators are now looking at various proposals on how to implement this objective. And we do this sector by sector. Responding to climate change is also at the heart of the broader European Green Deal. And now we'll come to one of the issues that are of key importance for this conference today: energy import and import dependency. Now, generally, our import dependency as the EU for hard coal, crude oil, and natural gas in whatever form has risen significantly since the 1990s. When we look at gas, for instance, our dependency was about 50% in the 1990s. It went up to 90% about 3 years ago, and then dropping back to slightly over 80% last year. The reason for that is twofold: declining European own natural gas production, but also replacing of other fossil fuels by gas, and nuclear also by gas, and increased consumption. Now, in particular, when we look at Russia's role as a source of fossil fuels, we'll see that our dependency on Russia is very, very significant. 45% of EU natural gas comes from Russia, 27% of our oil imports, and 46% of our coal imports. Now, this clearly means that we have to address this dependency, and we are currently doing that already. And this brings me to my second point: energy and the war in Ukraine. Now, when we look at the energy dependency, we have also to take into account that there is a different spread of the dependency across the European Union, and that's uneven as a result of geography and policy choices of the past. Now, responding to the Russian war of aggression, our leaders decided in March to phase out our dependency on Russian gas, oil, and coal imports as soon as possible. and we are starting to implement that. First important stage is now a communication that was published last week, early, Repower EU communication that presented a plan how to implement that move away from dependency. And I think my colleague Scott Wyatt will discuss details on some of those implementation steps later today. But our immediate task, of course, is looking ahead, coming out of winter and looking ahead for making preparations for the next one. And some of these policy elements are included in Repower EU communication, like joint purchase of gas, LNGs, and hydrogen, but also questions regarding storage of gas. So overall, what we have to replace is, just to give you a figure, 155 billion cubic meter of gas imports from Russia. We want to bring it down by 2/3 before the end of this year, and then reach complete independence from Russian fossil fuels well before the end of this decade. There are three elements to our policy: diversifying supplies, reducing demands, and ramping up the production of green energy in the European Union. So these are the three pillars of our policy. In the short term, we will need alternative fossil fuel supplies to phase out our dependency. And this could imply, and I think we have to be quite clear about this, that in the short term, we might also increase the use of coal and also nuclear power as an interim step. In the medium term, our dependence on Russian fossil fuels will be achieved by primarily decreasing our fossil fuels needs altogether. And this brings us then in line with our overall climate change objectives. So at this point in time, we are working with our partner countries to look at diversification of gas supplies. A very important agreement has been signed with the United States, which will dramatically increase its LNG exports to the European Union and replace about Russian gas by 1/3 by the end of this decade. But we're working also with countries like Norway, Japan, South Korea, and Qatar, just to name a few. Gas storage will play an important role because it allows us to respond to peak demands, particularly during the European winter period, where 25 or 30% of our gas consumed in winter will increase. We've therefore now taken up policies to ensure that our gas storage is filled by 80% this year and 90% generally annually by the 1st of November. Now, all of that is part of what we want to do to accelerate our European Green Deal. I spoke about diversification already, but the other two priorities are to reduce dependence on imports under the EU power concept, Repower EU concept, ramping up renewable energy production and boosting energy efficiency. We have identified a few areas, and we'll discuss some more details later today, but just let me say that solar energy will play an important role here, and we have proposed strategies for a European solar rooftop initiative. In fact, copying a bit the example of Australia in some ways. And we also look at other forms that we've underused at this point in time, but that will certainly play a role going forward, from biomethane to green hydrogen. One element looks at bottlenecks on how to introduce renewable energies, for instance, too long permission projects and timetables, bureaucratic bottlenecks that we want to address and make it easier to bring additional capacities to the market. All in all, we have to be clear. Replacing switching from Russian sources will not be simple, and it will not be cheap, but we are prepared to take that step. We have submitted already a plan to terminate coal contracts after 4 months wind down period as part of our EU sanction policies. We are currently discussing also to winding down oil contracts and buying of oil from Russia as the next step of our EU sanction policy. And of course, as mentioned, gas reduction of 2/3 by the end of this year. So my last point is the role of Australia. First, let me say we much welcome the very positive response to Australia to our general global efforts to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We also much welcome the sanction package as well as the support given to the Ukrainian government. And I'm sure my colleague Vasyl will speak more about that. As the world's biggest exporter of LNG, Australia plays a leading role in meeting the natural gas needs of Asia. We do not necessarily expect that Australian LNG will reach in significant quantity the European market, but it could increase to Asian markets and therefore free up capacities for countries like Qatar, who are also supplying the Asian market, to be redirected to Europe. And the last element here is also looking at a good example of Australia, how to introduce renewables. Solar rooftop is one of those, but we also need to have a supply of critical minerals to develop energy efficient technologies. And we are looking forward to working closer together with Australia in that regard, not least also as part of a future free trade agreement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Myroshnychenko, may I invite you to the podium, please?
Your Excellencies, I'm very happy to be here, and this is a very important topic that we are addressing today, energy, because if you look at the energy sector in Russia, this is what has been funding the Russian military throughout the centuries. In the old days, in the 19th century, it was the export of wood, fur, coal. Now in the 20th century, it's primarily fossil fuels such as gas and oil, while coal to a certain extent as well. Energy policy of Russia has always been closely linked to the national security and defense policy of Russia. Russia has weaponized energy, and they've been very skillful at that. We have to actually backtrack a little bit and look at the Soviet Union and the exports of the Soviet Union coming to the European markets. It's very important to understand that it has started a long time before. And I think the German Ostpolitik and the German sort of Eastern European policy on Soviet Union was part of it. In a way, most of the Germans I met and talked in my life, they all believed that the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt was something which actually contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I beg to differ. I think actually that Ostpolitik was the one which extended the life of the Soviet Union. It would have collapsed 10 years sooner, because the economic model of the Soviet Union just didn't work. It was not viable, and Soviet Union would have collapsed sooner if it was not for that Ostpolitik policy, which actually supplied Soviet Union with hard currency and actually sustained the life of the Soviet Union. However, I would agree that maybe that Ostpolitik helped the unification of Germany, that's for sure, which is of course a very important historic moment. So for Russia, energy is, well, this is all they sell. Look, this is the key export. Today, the daily export of gas to Europe accounts for 600 million euros per day, right? If you look at the overall export of gas from Russia, it's now $1 billion US. So if Russia can sell only one item, which is gas, they can sustain this war against Ukraine for another 2 years with no problem. Therefore, it's so important to address this issue and to actually come with solutions or some suggestions on how to address this issue. Weaponization of energy. I think the way Russians do it is the multiple ways that they've been doing it. Energy and the revenues generated for energy is, of course, apart from being used for the Russian military, it's also been used for the bribery in Europe. A term which was coined by President of Estonia, which is called Schroederization, sorry, I mean, that's a difficult word, which named after the Chancellor of Germany, Herbert Schroeder, who sits on the board of several of those gas companies. But there are many of those in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and other countries, Slovak Republic, Italy as well. And they basically enjoy their retirement, having good paycheck per year coming from here, which they earned officially. But there is a great deal of money which is in the gray zone, and Russians are very good at bribing those former politicians, who they find very poor and greedy actually, and they don't. And Russians are very generous, just like Chinese. They like to spend a little bit of money if they can get you in the pocket, and they like it. They can also put you in a honey trap, and you risk compromise on you, or they can use any other possible active measures currently used by the the intelligence officers going back from the Soviet times. So then you don't really know what's the motivation of this or that politician, why he's so keen on Russia, like Viktor Orban for the time being, which is hard for me to grasp and understand. But I think there is something we are not yet aware of. We'll find out one day what is that keeps him so close to Putin, except for his authoritarian kind of inclinations that he is having. But now, of course, now in the retrospect, we also have to look on the nuclear policy and the nuclear energy, because I think in a way that Germany once decided to phase out nuclear energy, which was CO2 emission energy kind of source. Was it rational to do it? The whole strategy of Germany on the energy policy in this front was actually based on the assumption, and of course I understand after the Fukushima and all this, what happened in Japan, they felt compelled to phase it out. That their strategy was to actually rely more on Russian gas. Now in the retrospect, we believe it was a wrong decision. Of course, there's not much can be done about it. Now, what Russia is doing, right? Russia is manipulating the gas market. They do it by limiting the supply of gas to Europe. They're sanctioning German companies. They're creating glut in the market, which causes a surge in prices. And the only way they're basically blackmailing the German economy to force Germany to launch Nord Stream 2. For the past 8 years, I've traveled to many European countries where I could speak, address similar audiences like you. And it was not only me, but also my friends and colleagues, also from the government, who are talking about Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. And our key message was that once Russia completes these two pipelines, they will attack and invade Ukraine. It fell on deaf ears in Berlin, it fell on deaf ears in France, in Brussels, everywhere. Nobody could believe that Russia could actually invade Ukraine. Why would they do it? It didn't make sense. Currently, Russia, on the occupied territories of Ukraine, are siphoning huge amounts of gas to power and for the needs of the plants, which are actually now under the Russian occupation in Luhansk and Donetsk. And the estimate of this is around $1 billion per month, which actually is now billed to Ukraine. Because the way the trade in gas happens, you have a meter at one side and you have a meter at the other side, and you have to pay for whatever the meter says. that now Ukraine has an extra bill of $1 billion per month to pay for the plants, which are now, you know, helping Russians in the occupied territories of Ukraine. How do we address that? Also, for some reason, you know, Russians have bought all the gas storage facilities in Europe, and I think Ambassador addressed that. He didn't mention that it's now most of them now owned by Russians actually, and how rational that was to sell the gas storage facilities in Europe to Russia. I think we should be calling a spade a spade. I mean, we don't really have time to actually, you know, be diplomatic on this, because I think the whole security of the EU depends on what's going on there on the gas market and on the energy market. What is important is that the EU, you know, this is just ridiculous. Just realize EU is paying twice. So the EU is paying the high price for the gas. Russians take the money from this gas, fund the army. The Russian troops come, invade Ukraine, kill Ukrainians, destroy our infrastructure, and then the EU pays for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Billions of dollars, billions of euros of the money which from the EU taxpayers will be used for the reconstruction of the country. So I think it's high time to actually get prepared for a shock. It should be a shock for the Russian gas export industry and for the Europeans as well. We need to phase out Russian gas completely as soon as possible, because it just doesn't make sense. I think where Australia stands, we got a donation of 70,000 tons of coal from Australia, for which I'm very thankful for. That was a huge help. A number of power stations, most of the power stations in Ukraine depend on coal. We cannot source coal in Ukraine because it's under the Russian occupation. We cannot source coal in Europe of certain type. We do some of that from Poland and other countries, but not much, as coal has been phased out there, or is being phased out. So we've been using your coal. We'll be buying more of your coal because we need it. Our heating system depends on coal, on a certain type of coal. It's actually anthracite coal, which is this high-powered coal, which we need. And I think there's some of that here in New South Wales, and we're getting from you. And we'll keep on buying that. We need it. We've been also sourcing uranium here in Australia. As you know, we have five nuclear power stations. 4 of them are operational. In the past, we depended on the Russian nuclear fuel. Recently, during the past 5, 7, 8 years, we've been diversifying. We worked with American Westinghouse, and the Westinghouse was sourcing some of the uranium here in Australia and enriching that and supplying for Ukraine. So this is another contribution of Australia to the security, national security of Ukraine. I would also like to speak a little bit about the hydrogen project, and I think a company, Fortescue Future Energies from Western Australia, and their plan to develop green hydrogen here and supply it to Europe. I think this is a way forward. You read it in the news about the memorandum of understanding which was signed between this company and the E.ON, the largest energy company in Germany. I hope that this can fly and that can take off, because I think that would really help Europe to diversify energy supplies. Also, there is maybe there are some chemists here, but what I learned from chemical engineers, the composition of the Russian gas is different from the composition of the LNG coming from Qatar. And for the energy and for the industry in Germany and Italy and other countries to adapt to a new kind of gas, they need to invest money, a lot of money, to adapt to this kind of different composition of that gas. It needs to be done, it needs to be addressed, and I hope that the companies in Germany are working on this to make themselves compatible and being able to use the Qatar gas or US LNG, which will be coming to the European market. I think it's enough for my introductory remarks. I think we will be able to talk more in details, and thank you very much for doing this conference. I was a bit late. I was on my way from Sydney, where I attended a big event there yesterday, but I'm happy I made it on time. Thank you.
please. Professor Jotzo, can I invite you up now? Thank you.
Excellencies, guests, colleagues, it's a privilege and actually, a really good thing that we can come together in person and discuss these things for the rest of the day. And just to say our thoughts collectively, of course, with the people of the Ukraine. So I've prepared quite extensive notes, but we've heard two very detailed and insightful talks about the situation in Europe, about the underpinnings of Russia's energy trade and so on. And so I will be a little bit selective in skipping through my extensive notes here to leave us more time for discussion. There's a word in the German language, it's called the Zeitenwende, right? And it's one of those words that carries a lot of meaning. I would translate it as something like, the turning of tides in history. It's a word that was used in German parliamentary debates just recently. And arguably that's what we're seeing following Russia's aggression on the Ukraine in Europe, but to an extent also globally. And so this shock, of course, in the energy sphere has obvious implications for geopolitics, for energy security and how it's conceptualized, for energy trade, but also for the energy transition, the transition towards low carbon and ultimately zero carbon energy systems, as well as industrial systems, transport systems, and so forth. Excuse me. Russia, of course, a very large producer of fossil fuels and exporter of fossil fuels. It's been said the majority, a very large share of Europe's fossil fuel imports come from Russia, about 45% of Europe's gas imports, importantly. Last year, Russia's revenue from selling fossil fuels accounted for over half of its total export revenue, around about $240 billion US last year, possibly more this year with the rise in prices, but of course it depends just how quickly exports to Europe and other places will in fact fall. Prices for oil and other fossil fuels have shot up, but important to note that the oil price is actually not quite as high as it was for much during the period 2008 to 2013, inflation adjusted. So this is not an unprecedented thing. Falling fuel exports to Europe will, of course, hurt Russia's economy and send an important signal that way. But longer term, of course, we would not expect Russia's energy exports to cease, but essentially to be rerouted to other markets. And so, for example, pipeline expansion to China is already underway, and you may expect more Russian fossil fuels exported to South Asia as well. What about energy exporters? And much of what we're touching on, of course, colleagues will go into much greater detail in the afternoon sessions that we're very much looking forward to. So what about other exporting countries? Well, anyone exporting energy at this point in time is of course experiencing a tremendous price uplift to the extent that they're not locked into long-term supply contracts. This also provides an investment incentive to put more money into fossil fuel exploration or production and shipping and so forth. But of course, that's a short-term effect. Longer term, my argument is, and I think the analysis bears this out, longer term, on balance, the effect will be to favor renewable energy, primarily because it addresses energy security concerns. So what do we see in Europe? Ambassador Pulch, you've already mentioned it. The next winter is, of course, the issue in terms of heating fuels, heavy reliance of industry on fossil fuels from Russia. So really quite frantic efforts there to both reduce energy use in Western Europe, also Eastern Europe, and to find alternative sources of supply, in particular gas, which is most difficult because the vast majority of imported gas depends on pipelines, and that's not so easily backfilled. And so efforts, for example, to quickly build LNG import terminals in various places in Germany. What about the high prices? Well, many effects thereof. adverse social effects, energy affordability falling, energy poverty increasing, and not just, by the way, in energy importing countries, this is also an effect in energy exporting countries. And so when we think, for example, of Australia as a beneficiary of higher energy prices, well, it's the shareholders of energy producing and exporting companies that benefit. It's consumers and many energy using industries that actually suffer from this. Higher prices, of course, also foster innovation. Okay, in particular, in terms of alternative energy supplies, as well as energy efficiency. And so that is what we would expect the medium to long-term effect to be predominantly a push towards greater physical energy supply security. So when we talk about energy security, these days, what we mean is the really cold hard facts of having control over energy supply. And so in Australia, we don't think about this too much, other than potentially with oil imports. But if you're in a total net energy importing country, this is a very prevalent issue right now. And local energy sources reign in this. Renewable energy in particular is freedom energy, right? It's one of these buzzwords. Why? Well, because it's on your own territory and no one can turn it off for you. Same to an extent goes for nuclear power. And so what we see, not just in energy, but generally, is a resurgent and very strong move for autarky of supply chains, right? Critical supply chains you want to have on your own territory or among friendly states. So what this means is, of course, a tremendous upheaval in supply chains, in energy markets in particular. It can, in the longer term, lead to lower costs due to forced innovation, okay, particular energy efficiency, but also renewable energy systems. It may also lead to focusing on trade within blocks, right? So preferential trade between friendly nations, if you will. From an Australian perspective, then the question is, of course, will this mean that Australia's potential advantage or advantage as a potential supplier of zero carbon energy to other countries might be enhanced as a member of the friendly club of Western nations in a way. Australia's already, I think, likely to be a preferred location for future investments in zero carbon energy supply because of its relative political, economic, and trade stability. So expect investments to flow in a very big way, driven by Western European desires and concrete steps to get independent of Russian energy imports, and that longer term, I'm cutting short a lot here, will mean that we will see more rapid energy transition towards lower carbon systems. And so in a strange roundabout way, we will see more investment in fossil fuels in the short term, but we will see a more rapid shift away from fossil fuels in the medium to longer term. Thank you very much.
So thank you all to our speakers for such interesting and illuminating comments. We've got some time for questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, I would be grateful if you would stand and identify yourself and then speak clearly, addressing a question to the panelist or panelists when you would like to answer the question or respond to the comment. Thank you. Do I have any takers? Ambassador.
Do I need to use microphone?
No, we're leaving microphones, so please just speak clearly. It's only so that we don't hand things around. We don't have a circuit of microphones.
I didn't want to be the first one, but here I am. I'm the Estonian ambassador. My question is for the Ukrainian ambassador. I think you were correct to say that EU will pay twice. And one of the ideas that we have been promoting is a sort of escrow account. So yes, we do need Russian gas, but some of the payments that we are making to Russia are kept there to rebuild Ukraine later. And we have been trying to promote that idea around Europe. How does Ukraine feel about it? And could that sort of take the price down a bit?
But I think this is a very good idea, and I understand it takes time to reduce or get rid of this dependence on gas. So escrow account, and this maybe not everybody understands how it works. So basically, the money is going to put in a special account somewhere in the EU, and then only partially it will be sent to Russia. A big part of it will be sent to Ukraine for the reconstruction, and that will still give some money for the Russians, but also will give money for Ukraine's reconstruction. Another way how it could be done, it could be some have to do this imposed on the fossil fuels, especially on gas, which will make actually the price of the Russian gas more expensive, but that would force Russia to reduce the price actually to make their product more competitive on the market. But again, this duties which will be levied on that gas could be then used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. I think this could be a good financial mechanism of what could be done. But I understand it's only now in the discussions, there is no clear mechanism being launched. As I know that this issue will be also raised and discussed at the World Economic Forum at their annual meeting tomorrow and the day after tomorrow in Davos. I think many people will be looking and discussing that, but of course, I think it should be at the Brussels level, which, that mechanism has to be found. Because what happens that now, Russia stops supply of gas to Bulgaria and Poland, putting more pressure. And then they force countries to pay in rubles. Basically what that means, you open an account with Gazprom Bank, which is a Russian state-owned bank in Switzerland. You put your euros there, and then you convert it to rubles, and Russians get the rubles, right? But basically, it's just one of the ways of put pressure, and actually that props their ruble as a currency in Russia, and it doesn't really help Ukraine. This is just keeps on funding the war against Russian war in Ukraine. So, though I think Commission said, "Oh, this is going to be compliant with the sanctions," but really, I don't think so. I mean, this is not the point of sanctions, right? The point of sanctions is to make it painful. But I think what needs to be done, like Lithuania, that was the first country, I think, which got rid of all the dependence on the Russian energy supplies. And I think Lithuania started a long time ago by building this LNG terminal in Klaipėda, and they worked on it. They worked on it. It was a 10-year project. So I think that's a way forward. There needs to be an infrastructure built in the EU, which will help you get gas from other places, including, like, for instance, from gas and oil from Azerbaijan, from the Middle East, and transport it in tankers. So yeah.
Thank you. I got next questions, please.
I'm Ambassador of Poland. Thank you very much for 3 very interesting presentations. I agree with almost every word Ambassador Myroshnychenko, including the surprise for me probably, but also with the presentation of Michael. Thank you very much. It was very informative. And Professor, I have actually a question to you. I also agree with your assessments and about the change of tides. You started your presentation from this element. And I also agree that in the mid perspective, increasing of zero carbon energy is a potential response to the crisis and to the security, the energy security. It's very important. How do you think about the role of nuclear energy? This element was missing in your presentation. Do you think the change of tides also apply to possible role of nuclear energy in Europe in this context?
Thank you, Ambassador, for the question. And I should elaborate. What we will see in this view of the world is a very much strengthened reliance on domestic energy production sources, or more specifically, energy production sources that are largely under domestic control. right? And this will, of course, take different forms in different places. It means renewable energy anywhere and everywhere, because wind and solar is by definition local, unless it's converted into hydrogen and then or subsequent product then traded. In some places, it will mean greater reliance or longer continued reliance on coal. And so, for example, I'm guessing that in your country, you know, what's happening right now will, to some extent, delay the coal transition. Could be a reasonable guess. On nuclear, you know, countries that do use nuclear power to any meaningful extent in their electricity supply system will consider those as secure energy supply elements under their domestic control, because really all you need is the uranium import, which can be sourced relatively easily from many different places in the world. And so, yeah, so to emphatically agree, this is also a boost to nuclear power as an energy source, in particular because it is, of course, in no contradiction to the overall climate change objective that most countries pursue.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman here at the front.
It's a while bit since I've been called a gentleman. Tom Worthington from the School of Computing here at the Australian National University. During the pandemic, we saw a rapid emergency change to online working and online education. Is there scope for encouraging those changes to continue to reduce energy use on particularly transport fuels, for example, in Europe, and some implications for fuel uses? So perhaps we should use some technological solutions to change people's behaviour.
Is the question directed to all?
Anybody will do.
Yeah,
Although this is more.
I was going to say, as the economist on the panel, perhaps you might like to take the lead.
We'll do it very quickly. We're colleagues at ANU, so we'll have a chance to discuss in more detail. Look, I mean, we've seen a drop in transport, of course, during the pandemic, and we've seen a great resurgence since. And so, you know, in the best available estimates, there will be some reduction in transport compared to pre-pandemic levels, but it's small, right? It's just at the margin where some people are able to commute less, essentially, right? And so I do not think it's a material factor in these bigger picture changes we're experiencing.
But just to answer to your question, one of the direction that we've taken with our package to reduce CO2 emissions by 55% by the end of this decade. You actually have to break it down sector by sector to mainstream climate change policies in every single policy. So indeed, there are sometimes small impacts on certain policies, but you need to add them up. And I've seen, for instance, our directives on transport and mobility, urban mobility. This is a package that we discussed here with my Australian counterparts on how we could create synergy effects on these kind of introducing low emission mobility. And that is actually something of great interest to Australia, which is a highly urbanized country. And there you break it down again: road, rail, aviation, etc., in order to make achievable objectives and deadlines. So it's some of these elements that we've seen now introduced by the pandemic will stay. Teleworking has been accepted as part of a new type of life-work balance, but also with side effects on energy use, perhaps. But it also means that we have the different effects that will mean what will happen to inner cities, what will happen to business models that we've developed, use of home offices versus offices. You know, what are the emission effects if everyone has to heat his own office at home rather than a big office in the city. So there are some offers that we have to look at. But in principle, we have to look at every single aspect in order to bring it down.
Look, just 3 points very briefly. Definitely digitalization of our life has happened thanks to COVID. I think it wouldn't happen that fast if it was not for COVID. So we have to thank this pandemic for that. That's one thing. Another thing is actually it's more complicated and more nuanced, because working from home does not mean working more efficiently. So there is a big, productivity of labor and that, ability to work remotely. I mean, and there is no, basically, it's already proven that people working remotely are not as efficient as when they work actually from the office. It's good that we now have this option so people can choose. Another thing is also mobility and urban mobility. As of 8 weeks ago, I was advising Uber in Ukraine, which is a car hailing company. And as advising Uber on the sort of urban mobility in Kyiv, which is a city of 4 million people, we always said, look, car sharing will reduce the traffic on the roads. It will reduce the congestion. It will have a positive impact on the use of energy, right? Because you don't drive your car, you share a car, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, people are human beings. They want to travel, they want to socialize. And the fact that we couldn't travel for these 2 years did not contribute to our happiness. So I think we see a surge in travel now, which is actually we as consumers have to pay. I recently went to Perth twice. I looked at the price of tickets from Canberra to Perth, $1,200. I think for this money, before pandemic, you could go to Ukraine for this money. Now you only can get to Perth. Well, what's going on here? I mean, there is a monopoly here on the market, no competition, reduced flights, higher fuel prices, and people want to travel, but then now they cannot afford it in Australia. So you see, I mean, I think it's more complicated because I think it's, we just have to look at these different aspects. Yeah.
Thank you all. We've got time for one more question. Yes, the middle, please.
My name, and the Ukrainian ambassador stressed the urgent need for the dependence on Russian energy to be reduced as quickly as possible. And the professors also mentioned the staggering income that Russia receives currently. Do any of the panel have a view as to how long Russia can sustain the war given their current income from energy? How difficult will it be for the world and Europe in particular to influence those countries still buying Russian energy to desist from doing so?
I think I addressed it in my opening remarks. I said that if Russia can sell only gas, they can sustain this war for another 2 years without any problem. Because their gas exports globally, it comes down to almost $1 billion a day. And because of the surging prices, it's probably even more now. So if only one item, only gas, without oil, without gold, without diamonds, whatever, just only gas. So we need to introduce total embargo on this gas to be able to stop this war. That's the only way forward. There is no any other way, unfortunately, because this country has weapons of mass destruction. And if we cannot take out Putin militarily or somehow, and even if we do, what happens next? It does look like there is a plan, a succession plan out there. So gas is the only leverage which the world has.
And did you want to also respond?
Well, let me just add a few thoughts on this. The first is changing your energy supply system, as I mentioned, is complex, it takes time, and it's costly. That's a starting point. We are prepared to take that path. And as I said, we're now looking at every single fossil fuel that we import from Russia and determine how we want to go forward with that. It's not an easy process. In terms of income for Russia is actually altogether higher from oil than from gas. and therefore to reduce income levels for Russia to work on gas export bans would be faster than on anything else. When it comes to that, we have to look at possibilities to convince other countries around the world that they should buy less Russian oil, but how do you replace it? That would be the first question we get. At this point in time, there are no other capacities apparently that can be rigged up to replace the source of oil from Russia to, say, the Middle East or other places of the world. We do, therefore, also politically not have support in many countries around the world. They support us perhaps in the United Nations, where we condemned Russia's aggression, and that was a big success. Also here in the Pacific, which voted unanimously in favor of that resolution. But it's a completely different matter to ask some of the countries to not buy Russian oil anymore, particularly now that Russia has to offer its oil at a much lower price. We know that from Indian imports of Russian oil. But we can also look at other options. We can look at tanker capacities. We can look at insurance, whether it's possible to still insure tankers who deliver Russian oil, for instance. Things of that sort. Again, there are some legal constraints, there are some political constraints that we have to look at, but we are certainly prepared to work with other countries around the world to achieve that if we can.
Thank you very much for that. Now, look, we'll draw this session to a close. There will be opportunity to be discussing amongst yourselves and also with some of the panelists over the course of the day. The lunch will be outside in the foyer. But would you please now join me in thanking our panelists for such an interesting start to the day?